Can my stalwart dwarves weather the devastating firepower of an Empire gunline, or will they be blown off the board by the end of turn 2? Find out today on Runeforged. Today I'm going over my second round game from the Old World Legends Winter Tournament, which is being played online using warhall.eu. If you'd like to learn more about Warhall, there is a link to do so down in the description. This was a 2,000 point battle between my Dwarven Royal Clan and my opponent's Nuln Empire Gunline. You can find copies of our lists down in the description if you'd like to check those out for yourself. All right, so I was a little bit worried coming into this game, largely as a result of the scenario that we would be playing. Now, there are a lot of different moving parts for this scenario, so I'm going to make sure that it's up on the screen for you guys to look at. But the main thing that I was concerned about was that the board is oriented so that we'd be going across it long ways. And I was really concerned that if my opponent deployed most of his troops like right on the edge of the board, it would take me an additional turn, maybe even 2 turns, in order for the bulk of my forces to get across the map and into his main lines. And the reason that this is a problem is that he does have 2 Empire Great Cannons in his list, and those are very, very dangerous against the army that I've brought today. But there is a second part to this scenario that actually does work out in my favor quite a bit. And that is this Chilling Fog special rule here, which essentially just diminishes the power of shooting during the first turn of the game. I did actually feel a little bit better, though, after I saw what the map looked like at the end of the deployment phase. As you can see, my opponent did deploy most of his army here on the line, which means I would be able to get into him, maybe 1 to 2 turns faster than I otherwise would have been able to. So just to talk quickly about my main plan for this game, essentially my goal is to get this unit of Longbeards into the enemy cannons as quickly as possible, hopefully destroying anything between me and the cannons along the way. As I might have mentioned earlier, these cannons are priority number 1 to be destroyed. And that is because they pose such a significant threat to my army. Not only can they pretty easily pick off the Grudge Thrower and the Bugman's Cart, they're also very dangerous against the Anvil of Doom, especially as in this tournament, the toughness 10 was ruled to only apply in melee combat. So I definitely need to be shutting down those cannons ASAP. Next in the priority list, I'm also going to be very worried about the enemy Hellblaster volley guns. These are going to be incredibly dangerous to my Longbeards and my Iron Drakes in particular. And I am hoping that between my Grudge Thrower, my Trollhammer Torpedo, and maybe even my Anvil, hopefully I'm able to destroy a few of these volley guns before they're able to do significant damage to my army. I would also say, as kind of like a tertiary threat, these 2 relatively large units of Outriders with the captains in them could also be a problem for my infantry. Having said that, though, I am pretty confident that the Iron Drakes and the Rune of Wrath and Ruin from the Anvil should be able to handle those pretty well if I'm able to get off some clean shots. Also, throughout the course of the game, I do have to think about how I'm going to be dealing with these Road Wardens that ended up deploying behind my lines. But I think the truth of the matter is I just kind of have to resign myself to the fact that they're probably going to get into the Grudge Thrower pretty early and likely take it out in close combat. The upshot of that is that if they attempt to do that, my Anvil of Doom will be in position to pretty much blast them off the board, again with that Rune of Wrath and Ruin. So we'll see if that is how it ends up playing out. All right, so moving into Dwarf Turn 1, you can ignore some of these movement lines here. Those are the result of some redeployments that happened as a result of kind of the scenario special rules, but honestly, it didn't really have much impact on the game, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. So you can see that pretty much for the most part, I moved my army forward. The Longbeards were helped along with a successful cast of Rune of Haste and Urgency from the Anvil, which allowed them to move again and get very, very close to my enemy's front line. And the fact that I was able to get that rune off was actually hugely pivotal to the state of the game so far. In the shooting phase, I had a lucky shot from the Trollhammer Torpedo and the Iron Drakes that took out one of the Hellblaster volley guns pretty much immediately. Again, this was a very lucky shot because I actually needed 5s to hit because I moved, I was at long range, and also the scenario special rule makes it so you are -1 to hit for shooting during the first turn of the game. So I rolled a 5 to hit, I needed a 2 to wound, which I got, and then I luckily rolled the maximum of 3 damage to take that volley gun out on turn 1. So again, a pretty big win for the Trollhammer Torpedo, which usually is pretty inconsistent in my games. But I also made some pretty significant errors during this turn. The first was that I actually forgot to use the armor buff from the Anvil on my Longbeards, which is actually a huge misplay, and spoiler alert, is going to result in a lot of those Longbeards going down during the first turn of shooting. I do want to point out here that my opponent was really, really nice, and I think that if I'd asked him, he probably would have let me like wind back the clock a little bit and put that buff onto the Longbeard. But I noticed so late in the game that it really didn't feel fair to ask him to let me do that. So I just kind of let it ride how it was. Also, when I used my drilled special rule to redress the ranks on the Iron Drakes, I accidentally made them a little bit too wide, and it put them into the difficult terrain, which ends up making this unit much less maneuverable in future turns. And again, spoiler alert, this unit actually doesn't end up doing too much throughout the course of the game. And I think that's largely because I kind of mishandled the this first turn of the game. But yeah, so a little bit of a misplay on my part there. And lastly, I have this problem in a lot of games, but I'm really not sure what I should be doing with my dwarf cart at this point in the game. I'm kind of torn between kind of moving it up with the Longbeards to give them some additional maneuverability, or maybe I could have turned it around and tried to charge into these Road Wardens who are kind of threatening my Grudge Thrower. But regardless, what I ended up doing was just moving it over a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what my plan was in that situation. But yeah, again, that is a very common occurrence for me and the Dwarf cart. All right, so moving into Empire turn 1, you can see the various different troop movements here indicated by these red lines. And then in the shooting phase, he actually managed to destroy 10 of my Longbeards, which is a pretty nasty little hit to that unit. And it actually could have been so much worse if he had that third volley gun still alive, and if there wasn't the scenario special rule that made it so that all shooting was at an additional -1 to hit on this first turn. So considering that I messed up and forgot to put the Anvil buff on this unit, it could have been so much worse than it actually ended up being. So I actually got off a little bit lucky on turn 1. Also, another thing to note is that during this turn, I was fully expecting these two cannons to be shot into my Anvil of Doom, as it is a pretty easy target for those cannons. But my opponent actually ended up elected shooting them into the Longbeards, which contributed to so many of those Longbeards dying. In retrospect, I think if I was my opponent in this situation, I definitely would have shot the Anvil, as this is essentially, a relatively easy 300 plus points to pick up, and it wouldn't be able to buff my troops for the rest of the game, which would actually be a pretty huge blow to the rest of my army. But of course, hindsight is always 2020. All right, so as we come to the end of turn 1, if you are enjoying this video so far, please consider aiding me in my eternal struggle against the dreaded YouTube algorithm by crushing those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss out on more exciting old world content like this in the future. All right, so moving on to Dwarf Turn 2. This time I did remember to cast Rune of Oath and Steel on my Longbeards here before they charge into combat. And then you can also see that prior to this charge, I did drill out a little bit so that I could get a wider front, with anticipation that I would destroy this unit and next turn be able to overrun into the Hellblaster volley gun that's sitting right in front of me. The Outriders do elect to stand and shoot in this situation. I think my opponent originally planned on fleeing here, but I did point out that if he did flee in this position, he would be fleeing kind of down at an angle, and these guys would almost certainly be running off the board, which would essentially be free points for me. Now, I did also want to point out that although this may look like Mountain Pass, this scenario lacks the special rule that doesn't allow things to flee off the side of the board. In addition to that charge move, I also ended up moving the cart back here to kind of threaten the this unit of Road Wardens. And in reality, I'm actually not sure, even if I do get a charge, I'm really not sure if the cart is going to be able to win that, but I figure there's not really much else for it to be doing, so maybe it'll get lucky and I can save that Grudge Thrower from a nasty charge from these Road Wardens. Moving on to my shooting phase, the most notable thing that happened was my Grudge Thrower did manage to land a very lucky hit on one of the cannons up there on the hill, and fortunately was able to take it out with a single shot. So very, very lucky on my part in that situation. Also, the Anvil was able to get a Rune of Wrath and Ruin off on this top unit of Outriders here. Unfortunately, I rolled very, very low on the number of hits for the Anvil, and I was only able to take out a single Outrider. Moving on to the close combat phase. Kind of as a surprise to no one, the Longbeards were able to win this combat against the Outriders, and I think they either, I can't remember if I wiped them out completely or if they ended up fleeing off the board on this edge here. The end result is the same, as I ended up either pursuing or overrunning into this volley gun which is really good for me because I will be in combat on my opponent's next shooting phase, which means he will not be able to take any more pot shots at this unit of Longbeards. And it should be pointed out that even though this was the most likely outcome of the fight, this is actually a pretty huge moment for the dwarves early in this game. That was a pretty beefy unit of Outriders, including the captain character that was embedded inside. So I actually picked up a lot of victory points with this very early turn 2 charge. So very, very good news for the dwarves. All right, so as we move on into Empire turn 2, you can see some of the movement that's about to happen here. Essentially a lot of movement from these guys up here, as well as the road wardens on the side. And as you can also see, the Empire state troops, the halberdiers here, were able to move up quite a bit of distance with the aid of some arcane urgency from the Empire wizard. Unfortunately for my opponent, the Empire shooting was largely ineffective on this turn. The big letdown was the cannon shooting at the Anvil of Doom. He did manage to score a hit, but unfortunately, even though he only needed 2s to wound, he did actually roll a 1. So very, very unlucky on that cannon shot. Also, fortunately for me, the volley gun, when it shot into the Iron Drakes, was not able to manage to take any of them out. And all of the remaining shooting from the Outrider, the War Wagon, and the Road Wardens also similarly bounced off the very, very high toughness of the Anvil and the Grudge Thrower. So no effective shooting coming out from any of those units this turn. In retrospect, I wonder if my opponent could have / should have, instead of shooting with the Road Wardens, maybe try to get a charge into the Grudge Thrower, as I think there's a pretty reasonable chance that they are able to win in that combat. And even if they aren't, as of right now, they're not really going to be able to do much damage from the position that they're in, because both of the units that are kind of in their threat range are relatively resistant to any sort of damage that they're able to dish out, at least from range. Moving on to the close combat phase, the Longbeards were able to pretty easily dispatch this other Hellblaster volley gun, and again overran into this very unfortunate engineer here. All right, so moving into Dwarf Turn 3, I was able to successfully get the Rune of Oath and Steel off on the Iron Drakes here, and unfortunately I did forget to move the Dwarf cart on this turn. Although to be fair, I probably just would have moved it over here to kind of contest where these Road Wardens would be at the time. And that leads us very nicely into my Dwarf shooting phase, where the Anvil of Doom was able to get off a very, very nasty Rune of Wrath and Ruin on these Road Wardens back here, and did actually manage to wipe that entire unit with a single spell. So well done for the Anvil on that one. Also during the shooting phase, prior to the Longbeards overrunning here, this Grudge Thrower was able to score another direct hit on the other cannon on the hill. Unfortunately, I only got 2 wounds, so I wasn't able to take this cannon out all the way. But I do have to point out that the Grudge Thrower has done a great job this game. In fact, much, much better than it usually does on average. During the close combat phase, my Longbeards were able to take out that lone engineer and once again overrun and find themselves in close combat with that wounded cannon. And it is worth noting that from this position, I have exposed myself to a flank charge from this unit of halberdiers. But if I'm being completely honest, I'm not super concerned about that unit, as I just don't think they're going to have the damage necessary to inflict any sort of meaningful losses on the Longbeards. Now, in theory, it is a little bit dangerous, because if I were to lose this combat, I don't have very far to run before I'm off the edge of the board. But I feel pretty confident that not only will the Longbeards end up winning this fight, even if we do kind of get stuck in for several turns, my king is eventually just going to keep challenging until he's able to get into the enemy general. And if I'm able to get into a challenge with the enemy general, I don't think I'm going to have any problem whatsoever taking him out. All right, so moving into Empire turn 3. As expected, the halberdiers do charge into the flank of the Longbeards here. Unfortunately, the War Wagon did fail a charge on the Anvil, due to the difficult terrain that the Anvil is sitting in. And you can just generally see that a lot of his other units did move forward. Again, unfortunately for my opponent, he wasn't able to do much in this shooting phase. The Iron Drakes were fairly impervious to the additional shots coming out from the volley gun, and the Outriders just don't have the strength necessary to pose any sort of significant threat to either the Anvil or the Grudge Thrower, at least from range. Moving on to the close combat phase. As you can see, the Longbeards did manage to win this combat. Not only were they able to take out the remaining wound on the cannon, but my king actually ended up destroying the unit champion in this unit in a challenge. And I actually managed to overkill by quite a bit as well. So there was no real risk of me losing this combat. And that unit of state troops did end up falling back in good order. And my unit pursued, but I wasn't able to get very far because there is actually a cheeky little engineer here that is blocking my pursuit. All right, moving into Dwarf Turn 4. I decided to do a reform maneuver on my unit of Iron Drakes back here, and then I'm also able to cast Rune of Haste Urgency on that unit with the Anvil, so I am able to move a little bit further than I normally would be able to. But unfortunately, most of my Iron Drakes are out of range, and I'm pretty sure that the Trollhammer Torpedo whiffed its shot against that volley gun. And I do go ahead and move the cart back into hopefully within range of this Iron Drake unit to give them some additional movement on the next turn. During my shooting phase, I did manage to get off another Rune of Wrath and Ruin from the Anvil onto this unit of Outriders. This time I was able to take out 3 of them, which honestly I'm pretty happy with. I think the Grudge Thrower also took a shot at this volley gun over here, but I'm pretty sure he did whiff on that shot. Then in the close combat phase, these Longbeards did manage to take out this initial engineer here and overran into the second engineer. All right, moving into Empire Turn 4. At this point, I'm pretty sure my opponent has moved into pure points denial mode, which I think for the most part is the correct play. And as you can see, he basically just moves everything he can as far away from me as physically possible, except for the War Wagon, which he does charge into my Anvil of Doom. In retrospect, I'm not sure if this is the best play. The good news is it will most likely tie up my Anvil for at least a couple of turns. But the downside is that he might have been able to get over into this Grudge Thrower. And if this War Wagon does end up charging the Grudge Thrower, I think there's a very good chance that that Grudge Thrower is not long for this world. So he would be able to pick up at least a couple points from that Grudge Thrower. Alternatively, he could have tried to charge the Outriders into the Grudge Thrower, or at least set up a charge for next turn. So that is another possibility. In the close combat phase, my Anvil does actually manage to do a wound to the War Wagon, but because the War Wagon is close order and I'm not, that fight does turn out to be a standstill. Also in the close combat phase, the unit of Longbeards was able to take out that last engineer there on the hill and ended up overrunning into that last volley gun. All right, moving into Dwarf Turn 5. I ended up moving both my Iron Drakes and my cart forward, but it turns out that my shooting phase was a bit of a comedy of errors. I did end up shooting the Grudge Thrower at this unit of handgunners over here, hoping that I would take out enough of them that I could trigger a panic test and have them run off the edge of the board. But unfortunately here, as you can see from the scatter and the temple location, it did actually go widely off target, and I actually managed to destroy 2 of my own Longbeards with that shot. But fortunately for me, moving into the close combat phase, this unit of Longbeards was able to easily take out the volley gun and ended up overrunning over back towards the Halberdiers. Now, I do think that I made a bit of a mistake here. I think it would be possible for me to, before I take my pursuit move, to drill out further. And if I had done so, I could have overrun into the unit of handgunners, which would have been really, really good for me. Unfortunately, I forgot about that, and I just ended up moving like directly forward. And then kind of moving over here into the Anvil combat, the Anvil does manage to do an additional wound onto the War Wagon and suffered none return. But again, because the wagon has close order, we do draw combat for 2 turns in a row. All right, so at this point, we would be moving into Empire Turn 5, but I'm just going to save you all some time. Basically, nothing meaningful happens for the rest of the game, except the War Wagon does able to manage to do a single wound to the Anvil of Doom on the final turn of the game. And this is what the board looks like at the very end of my opponent's turn 6, which is the official end of the game. Unfortunately, our final score screen was bugged out just a little bit. As you can see, my opponent's army is actually showing where my army should be showing, but it really doesn't impact things too much, so we're just going to use this as our placeholder. So I did manage to pick up 1,184 victory points baseline, and then I got an additional 75 victory points because I was able to destroy the striking a grudge target that I set at the beginning of the game. So the final score was 1,259 to 0. Which did result in a final battle score of 16-4. And for this tournament, it does put me at 1 win and 1 loss, with a total of 21 battle points. So overall, a pretty good game for the Dwarves. I also just wanted to give a very quick shout out to my opponent, who was a very friendly dude, and also, like me, is very new to Warhammer The Old World. And overall, he gave me a really fun game. It was very enjoyable all around. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please consider checking out this next battle report, which should be popping up on your screen right about now. Also, definitely be on the lookout for my next battle report, which should be covering the 3rd round of this online Old World tournament. But I think that's about it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye.